All right, I've got a fun one tonight. All sorts of trendy stuff here. We've got EC2 and Chef, which is sort of one of the new kids on the block. So how many of us have to deal with configuring servers? All right, most of us. Obviously, being Ruby developers and a large portion of Rails developers here, we're deploying our stuff on servers all the time. How many, show of hands, how many people are running an application on just a single server? So everything on one thing, all Apache. Okay, keep your hands up if you are running it on more than one server. So maybe you split off your database. Okay, most go down. We'll still have a handful. Hands up if you still have more than 2 servers that you're running an application on. So maybe you've got a app and a database and a Solar. Still got like 4 or 5 hands up there. Okay, so how many of you guys, do any of you use configuration management software right now? Right, we've got 2, 3 people. All right, cool. So the rest of you should be in for a treat here. So how many of us remember the good old days when we have to build our own hardware, and it takes like 6 weeks to get a server put together, and we host it in a closet or some rack somewhere hiding in our office. Back in those days, you typically don't mind configuring your server by hand, because once it's up, you just kind of leave it up, check the uptime every couple of months, and kind of pat yourself on the back that you've had your kind of Linux web server running for 6 months straight without reboots. So I mean, this it works because it takes such a long time to get from, I want to run an application on a server, to get from wanting that to having that happen. We spend most of our time waiting for other stuff to happen. And that's gotten a little better, especially with the whole, VPS phenomenon. It takes a lot less time these days to go from I need a server to I have a server. Anyone could just go sign up for an account on some random VPS provider, Slicehost or something, fire up a new server. But you still have to do a fair amount of configuration. And it involves, we may have our operating system ready for us to go, but we still have to log in, install the software we need, get it configured, get it set up to run our site. And there's a lot of good tools for that. If you're pretty efficient with your time, you're familiar with scripts to make that a little easier. The deprec gem is a great example for Rails sites. There's a whole lot of clever solutions out there. Maybe you just have some shell scripts that you maintain, and run those on any brand new system that you've got. I'm sure a handful of us have quite a collection of that sort of thing. So breaking this thing down into the process of what we're looking at when we talk about configuration management. First step is provision. This is this process of I need hardware to run this on. This has been the bottleneck up till the last couple of years, and that's been getting quicker and quicker to get your instances provisioned. Once you've got your server up and running, you've got to bootstrap it. You need all your prerequisite software. This is things like your programming language, Ruby obviously, your Ruby gems. Whatever else you need to do your work. Then there's the configuration step. You've got Apache up and running. You need the virtual host files, things like that. You need your MySQL config. And then the 4th step, as all the cool kids call it these days, is command and control. This is keeping track of how your server's doing, what's going on your server, what's happening, what do I need to do in response to what's happening on my server. So, without further ado, and because I spent almost no time on my slides, let's dive into Chef. Chef is configuration management, a little bit of command and control. So, once you've got your server up and running, once you've got your server bootstrapped in order to run Chef, it does all sorts of handy stuff for us. So imagine a couple steps back. If you're efficient at what you're doing right now, you're using some kind of script to build your systems. The naive example would be just a shell script. You need to compile something from source, so you download that file into your temp directory, cd over there, unzip it, run configure, make install, and your package is installed. Now, what happens if you need to run that script again? Oh, well, shoot, I either just go comment out that block of code and run it again, or add some conditionals to check to see if files or binaries are present. This gets into a key aspect of configuration management called idempotency, or idempotency, or however you like to pronounce that word, where we need to be able to write scripts that you can run a bunch of times and not make changes that they don't have to make. They don't have to download files that you've already downloaded. And we're not going to compile packages that we have already compiled. We're not going to install packages that we've already installed. And this is where Chef comes in. And Chef is a Ruby DSL, essentially, to abstract out this process of testing to see whether it needs to do what you're telling it to do. So Chef is composed at the lowest level of resources. And these resources represent things on your system. We're thinking things like directories, symlinks, files, files that get pulled down from a remote URL, or files that get generated from a template. You've even got abstraction for services, users, all sorts of handy stuff like that. And we're just going to jump right into some Chef locally. And so we'll start here at the Ec2 Console, and I'm going to spin myself up an Ec2 instance. And should all go well, we will have a handy little Rails server running in just a couple minutes. I'm not mirrored at the moment, so you guys aren't watching me do this. Give me just a second. Yeah. Arrangement, mirror displays. Fantastic. Okay, now you guys are watching me. So back to the AWS Management Console here. Poor thing probably wants to be refreshed, but I've grabbed one of the Elastic AMIs. They're pretty handy. We just got the 32-bit Jaunty. And I'm going to spin up a medium. Don't really care too much about our options there. I'm going to provide some user data to do the bootstrapping. So I think my phone is making some noise here on the mic. Give me just a sec. Yeah, bye-bye. Okay, so the provision is asking EC2 to fire up our instance. And the cloud is really, when it comes to using the cloud, the part where it really shines is how quickly you can provision these instances. I mean, you can make an API call to ask for an instance, and you've got it fired up in 5 minutes or less. 1 minute, maybe, if you've got not a lot going on there. And this is where configuration management really comes into its own, because there's no sense manually configuring an instance that maybe even has been automatically instantiated by some script you've got watching your cloud. And so this is where Chef comes in. So I'm passing in my Bootstrap script. We will let that fire up and run while I show you a few other things. Chef has fantastic documentation, so if you find yourself curious about any of this, just Google opscode Chef. Opscode is the company behind it, and it's fantastic. So I mean, don't be intimidated by any of this that you see. If you don't quite, if I don't quite explain it well enough, it certainly will fill in the gaps. The installation in particular, literally just read this, follow along, fire up some EC2 instances, and they really take you through step by step. I mean, this is their documentation for the resources, and it really breaks it all down. And what I'm going to do here is go through a couple of these resources to start with, and write them from scratch and kind of walk you through that process. Once we get through a few of those, Opscode has a fantastic Git repository full of cookbooks. Resources are used in recipes. Recipes are collected in cookbooks. So these cookbooks do all sorts of stuff. We're talking about installing Django, EC2 stuff, HA proxy, Apache, Rails, Nginx, you name it. Someone's probably actually already written a cookbook for it, which is another great thing about Chef, is it's got a really active community surrounding it. So this is my particular fork of the cookbooks, and we will get back to that. I'm going to check on our instance. So we're running. That's good. It occurs to me that I may not have this PEM file on my machine here. But let me go ahead and connect to that machine. I totally don't. Bear with me real quick while I try that again. Raise your hand if you've done EC2 sites before. Not many. Okay. Well, maybe we should have a little EC2 Q&A when I'm done demoing Chef. So feel free to think of some questions. Okay, let's try this again. I'm going to launch another one with a key pair that I already have on my system. Sure, I'll get to that when I have things to actually show you. Okay. That's not very useful, is it? Okay, well, this might be a little nicer. It's not seeming to follow my mouse. Oh, there we go. Okay, so fire up another instance here. I need that bootstrapping script. I could just run this on the server itself, but it's a little more convenient, I think, to pass this in. This is a nice feature of the EC2 API. If you haven't worked with it before, you can pass in user data, and the way the Elastic AMIs are built, they'll just take whatever you pass in. If it starts with a shebang, it'll run it as a script. So I have nothing to distract us with now. We're just going to wait for this to build. But it shouldn't take too long. That didn't copy very nicely. So let's go ahead and SSH to this machine. Oh, apparently I have already connected to that IP at one point. Just move this out of the way. Oh, bad permissions. I should probably read the output of these error messages. Okay, so here we are on our fresh. I'm going to zoom out here and just give you guys a better font size. Okay, here we are on our fresh EC2 instance. We are still building stuff in our, that is useless, top. We're still doing stuff in apt right now. It's installing all these various packages. So let me go ahead and just walk you through some of the chef syntax. So what we've got here is the ops code cookbooks, and I'm starting here with their recipe for Rails. Ignoring all the comments and stuff, you can see this is a pretty simple recipe. Chef lets us include other recipes. It's a pretty natural thing to do. And you can see here we're getting Ruby from another recipe, and then we're just installing a gem package. There's a lot of different kinds of packages based on which provider. If you just use package, it'll default to whatever your system default is, like apt-get on Ubuntu. So this is really as basic as it gets. Some of the advantage, this include recipe for Ruby right here is not immediately useful to us on our first boot because we already do have Ruby, and on a fresh server it's probably a pretty recent version. But it really shines when we come into the configuration aspect of Chef, because Chef's designed to be run against your servers every 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 minute. And because it doesn't do things that it doesn't need to do, we can run it as often as we like against our servers, and it won't redo things. Now, that is to say until we want to upgrade our version of Ruby, in which case there will be a newer version of the package. We'll go ahead and load up the Ruby recipe over here. And you can see here we're just doing a Ruby package, and we're telling it to install. These packages abstract a lot of logic. They do things like check what version you already have installed. You can tell it different kinds of actions. There would be, maybe we'd want action upgrade. An action install is actually not going to upgrade it unless we specifically change that to upgrade. Things like Ruby or maybe Apache you're not going to want to touch if there's a newer version, if you haven't already vetted that version somewhere. And we can do a lot of neat things in Chef because it is essentially just Ruby. You can see we're using some case statements here to load up different packages based on your platform that you're running this on. And that's all just plain Ruby. And right here we're just iterating through the array that we set up just above here, which makes it really nice to maintain these scripts. If you ever go ahead and look up any other configuration management languages, CF Engine, Puppet, one of their major downfalls, in my opinion, is it's really hard to maintain them because they use their own language. It's not a Turing-complete language, not nearly as rich as Ruby is. And you can do all sorts of just normal refactoring on these kinds of recipes. So this actually was the full recipe here, where you can see we have this big array of gems, and that we just iterate through them and install each one, and so on and so forth. So another component to a Rails app server, something like Apache. So I'm going to show you the Apache recipe that we've got here, and maybe show a few new things while we're in here. Again, we've got just a package that we're installing from apt-get in this case. We vary the package name based on our platform, so that makes it really easy to write cross-platform recipes if you have to maintain this kind of thing, or more likely if you write something and want to distribute it, other people can then contribute to this to genericize it to their own particular platform. This stuff's a little complicated looking, but it's not too bad. I'm going to skip explaining it though, because that's just a lot of lines. Something more interesting going on here is, here's another example of a Chef resource, a directory. And we pull that directory name. So, perhaps a more basic example of a directory would be var www. And we can set some attributes on that directory through the Chef DSL here for directory. Owner and group. Maybe you want to make the permissions 755, something like that. So same thing here with this directory, only it's pulling the path out of a variable from somewhere else, creating that directory if it doesn't already exist. And this is the log directory. You need your log directory, otherwise things break. Bear with me while I check on our Bootstrap scripts. I don't trust that this is actually running, which will be a bummer. Another handy resource we've got here, the execute resource, just running arbitrary commands. We've given this just a name. It's a kind of label. You could have the command itself in there, but the command in this case is kind of long and unwieldy, so we've overridden it with this command directive. And these are all pretty uninteresting because it's so technical. Apache is Apache. So I'm going to write one from scratch here for you guys and use a pretty common example of something that I think most of us have dealt with when setting up a Rails site. And we're going to install Ruby Enterprise. So first thing I'm doing is I'm creating the directory structure. We created a folder, Ruby Enterprise, for the cookbook itself. And inside that we've got a recipes directory. And that last one there is just a typo, but I will hold off on deleting it. Zooming out again. We're going to create a new file, default.rb. So if you specify, if you want to use this recipe from somewhere else, you'd just say include recipe Ruby Enterprise. If you don't give it anything more specific than that, it'll go to the default. Otherwise, you can break your cookbooks down into multiple different recipes. So this would be the foobar recipe in the Ruby Enterprise cookbook. So we're going to do a couple different things with Ruby Enterprise. And it's a pretty typical download, unzip, compile, make install. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this link. And we're going to start with a remote file resource. Remote file is what it sounds like. Gets a file from a remote source. And in this case, we're going to get it from that download link from the Ruby Enterprise website. And this takes care of downloading that file. This is basically our wget command. And once that is there downloaded, we're going to want to unzip that thing. So you can see here maybe the parallels between the shell script that you might write. If this was a shell script, we'd be saying, you know, wget -l or something, this zip, this tarball from a remote source, and then, you know, change directory to where it lives, and unzip it. So similar here. We are unzipping, downloading and unzipping. We can tell an execute command where its working directory is. And we can tell it handy things like we expect it to create this directory. In this case, it'll have a version number after it, but this is all just kind of for the sake of demonstration. And it knows, because we've told it that it creates that directory. If that directory exists, when we go to run it again, just skip that command, because we know it's already done. And furthermore, when we get inside there, I believe it's like a install.rb or setup.rb inside that directory. And likewise, we can tell it, you know, this is going to create opt Ruby Enterprise or some such. Being Ruby, we can do some useful refactorings at this point. We can pull that version out into just a local variable and later into a chef attribute. And this is pretty much a complete and useful recipe right here that installs Ruby Enterprise for us. So once we have our recipes written, probably the trickiest thing about Chef when you're first getting started with it is the workflow. And these recipes all run locally on the machine that you are configuring. And Chef has a client that handles, obviously, interpreting this DSL into useful system commands. There's two different clients for that. One's called Chef Solo, which you point Chef Solo at a bunch of recipes, give it some options, and it goes to town and just runs them. Another is Chef Client, which interacts with a whole different portion of Chef called Chef Server. You can set up a server that serves these recipes to the clients that are asking for them. And along the way, it collects all sorts of information that the client reports back to that server. And it's an important piece of kind of that command and control infrastructure, if we get back to that, because you can use that to distribute updates to your recipes, tell different nodes of different roles to do different things, even monitor memory usage or load on your systems. It collects all sorts of useful information. And for example, if you do auto-scaling, you may have a server that spins up from some condition. Say your load goes over a certain value for the last time period, and you fire up a new app instance to accommodate that load. You may be booting it off of an AMI that's fairly recent, but doesn't have quite the same configuration as the latest and greatest recipes. So the first thing it would do, check in with a Chef server, pull down all the latest recipes, run them to configure itself, and register itself with load balancer, all that kind of good stuff. So really, this is really just an intro to Chef, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what's possible. Unfortunately, my live demo is a flop, so you guys aren't going to get to see this thing run. And I think that I would just go ahead and turn this into a little bit of a Q&A, and then maybe hand it off to some hacking. So, Matt. Oh, yes, let's pass around the microphone.
Hey Nick, since you could not do the demo, could you show us if, for instance, I wanted to go home tonight and just deploy my app on Slice Host, and I don't know anything about Chef? Could you just show me the few steps to do that in 2 minutes?
Yeah. I'm tempted to just log into one of my production systems and show you guys there. Yeah, hey.
Is it easier to show on EC2 or Slice Host or something like that?
I mean, really, the issue there was just the bootstrapping, getting the gems installed and stuff. I could even run some of this stuff locally here, although it's not exactly designed for OS X. I'm going to go ahead and just log into one of my work systems for you guys. Actually, let me see if I can remember. Oh, this, the main thing, so getting back to this point of the workflow, this is really the trickiest part to Chef. You write your recipe, now you need to run it on the server, but first
wait. Let's say we don't have recipes. Like,
okay, yeah, no recipes.
Where do you find them? Where are they? What do you need to install on your local machine?
Yes. The installation stuff on the Chef wiki is fantastic for getting you to the point where you can run recipes.
Okay.
And then on GitHub, they've got a cookbooks repository with recipes for all sorts of different stuff. And when you're getting started, usually the first step for a Rails app server, you need Apache 2 running. You need Rails running. You can just go ahead and look at those cookbooks that other people have already done and just steal them wholesale. Just run them directly. And that's a great way to get started because for the most part, it all works really well. You may get to a point where you need to tweak something slightly differently than the cookbook has been designed for, and that's usually a great jumping off point for writing your own from scratch and just testing that, iterating on it. The Ruby Enterprise example is a particularly apt one because nobody seems to have really published one of their own. So most people kind of end up writing their own, and it's a great intro to learning what Chef's all about and getting a feel for it.
So you need to install Chef on the remote server right away?
You do, yes.
Does that require Ruby or something like that?
It does require Ruby, yeah.
So how do you install Chef in Ruby?
Chef in Ruby came from the Bootstrapping script that I pasted in.
Okay. So on the case of SliceHost, for instance, how do you run this Bootstrap script?
I mean, it's literally just these commands right here.
Put it in and then
just
run
update, and the installation wiki covers that pretty well for a couple different OSs. This is for Ubuntu. We're just installing here. You can see Ruby, Ruby 1.8 Dev, SSL, RDoc, all this kind of gem prerequisites. It's mostly just Ruby gems prerequisites. If you can install gems, you can install Chef. Chef comes packaged as a gem. This right here is just installing Ruby gems from source. So if you've got Ruby gems, installing Chef looks like that.
So once you have that set up, where do you put the recipes?
The recipes live in. So this is a configurable piece. Typically, you'll have an Etsy Chef directory on your server, and inside that Etsy Chef directory, you'll have. I'm going to write all this out as I go. So, okay, that's the shell script. You'll have an Etsy Chef directory, and inside Etsy Chef, you'll have, say, a cookbooks directory. And when you run Chef solo, it takes some options. The options is a little confusing because they come formatted as JSON. There's two bits to the options. I really should have finished my slides, shouldn't I? There's a config file that's in Ruby, and it's like 1 line, 2 line. It just tells you where are the cookbooks that I'm looking for. You'll tell it to look for Etsy Chef cookbooks. And then there's the JSON, which tell Chef which recipes you want it to run, among many other things. There's a lot to get into there. But for example, that might be a list of recipes, Apache 2, Rails, etc. Or sometimes what I'll do is I'll have a cookbook just for the application that I'm working on, or the company. And I'll say, so let's say Acme is the name of our application that we're working on. Maybe I'll have a recipe called app or a recipe called DB. And so sometimes I'll create recipes based on the roles, and from there include other recipes.
So you upload these recipes into the folder you decided where you're going to have all the cookbooks, and then you just call Chef solo on them?
Yes. So typically how I'll have it set up is something like this. I'll have the Ruby file here, the JSON file, all in the Etsy Chef. The Ruby file is, usually just cookbooks path. And the JSON, when you're getting started, is usually just this solo.json with the recipes, and then you'll invoke Chef solo and tell it the JSON is Etsy Chef solo.json, and the Ruby configuration is Etsy Chef solo.rb. And so what this does is says, look for cookbooks here. In those cookbooks, run the recipes that I give you here. So it's literally, it's that easy. If you don't mind editing your cookbooks on the remote server, you'll save yourself a couple steps. Just open up Vim and edit the stuff in cookbooks directly. Otherwise, you'll get into a routine of rsyncing or using git pushes or something like that. Which brings me to another point. As part of the work that I've been doing, I've got I spent about a month setting up a multi-server, 5 different servers per cluster for a production cluster and a staging cluster, all managed in Chef. So it's to the point where I run one command, it provisions all the servers, bootstraps them all, and runs Chef on all of them. Once that's done, I run cap deploy, and we've got a system that's live. The provisioning and getting into the good workflow to get the Chef stuff out there is probably the biggest caveat to configuration management. There are a handful of tools out there to help you do that. I don't really like any of them, so I wrote my own. And actually going to release that. I've got the Git repository ready to go. Just need to clean up some of the file structure of it. So I'm going to release that, open source it, so that anybody else who's interested in this kind of stuff can have something to help them out with the provisioning and, you know, getting the files copied over to the server. It uses NetSSH and NetSCP to sync the files over with rsync and connect to the server, run Chef solo, and drive that whole process. So basically, you just work on your recipes locally, save the file, run a command, and it sends it out to all the servers that you're working on. So if any of you are interested in really diving into this kind of stuff, feel free to contact me and let me know, and I can definitely help you out to get you running. Do we have any other questions while I screw up Keynote? EC2 general Q&A is fine too. Obviously, I'm more prepared to talk than show stuff right now. So.
First, was that script you were just talking about?
Oh, we'll get the microphone first. Okay.
Is there, do you set like the start, stop, restart command for any custom software that you want to install with Chef?
It's a great question. So Chef does have a resource for services, and there's a couple different ways you can do that. It defaults to a sysv init style, where you've got etc init.d and then the name of your service, and that script is assumed to handle the start, stop, restart. So if you're installing a package that installs its own, you can just say service, the name of the service. And you can tell Chef in that configuration block, you know, start the service. You can tell it to do nothing and have other resources trigger that service to start and stop. There's a lot of flexibility there. It's got support for run it, which is handy if all you've got is a binary that you just need to start and just stay running. If that binary dies, run it will restart it. And there are ways of making kind of custom start, stop, resource stuff. I wrote my own service definition for God. You basically just say service God, here's my start command, here's my restart command, here's my stop command. So pretty straightforward.
My only other question is just the, did you have any experience with Puppet before you jumped into Chef? And if you did, what benefits do you see from using Chef?
Yeah, Puppet is, essentially Puppet is, I would compare it to like a next generation CF engine. If you're familiar at all with CF engine, Puppet's just a fresh take on that. It's implemented in Ruby. Luke Caney's actually is a really cool guy. He came to SD Ruby a couple years ago, and we got to pick his brains about Puppet. I would say Puppet is probably more mature at this point. Chef's a lot younger. But the thing that really excites me about Chef is it's a much more minimalistic, and it's Ruby. You're not writing some custom language that gets passed through an interpreter. So those are the major differences, I would say.
Yeah. Was the scripts that you were talking about that you're working on, are those to take the place of what Amazon the console, the Ec2 console does, or are you?
A little bit. It's opinionated in the sense that it's meant to work with Ec2, but instead of manually starting servers that you need, it makes the API calls for you, and it does a lot of other stuff automatically. It's sort of based on a concept of you define a cluster, you define the roles in the cluster, and it creates SSH keys that are named with a certain naming convention to distinguish the different roles from each other. It creates all the different groups that you need, it creates the server. Basically, it's designed, if you have got an empty EC2 account, you don't need to log into the console. You just run the script, and it starts everything. But there's plenty of other stuff that the console does do that I don't bother with.
Okay. And one other thing, the default.rb that's in each one, if you're going to extend one of these cookbooks or recipes, do you typically just fork the project and then just make your changes to default, or is there a reason? Is it like supposed to be something other than default that you define, like copy to your own file?
Typically, you would fork and just make your own. Sometimes that's pretty beneficial because the changes you make may work for other people and you can get them pushed upstream. But there's no real complicated inheritance type mechanism in Chef that I'm aware of anyway. So, which is good. It keeps it simple. Or Patrick?
So, Capistrano, sometimes, you want to write a shell script that has bash if else then logic. That always is problematic for me. Don't know why it seems to never work. How is that in Chef, or has it been replaced by the DSL in Chef?
That's a good question. It kind of depends on what you're doing with those Capistrano. I'm still using Capistrano in the clusters that I'm managing, but it's a very minimal role. It's basically just to push the code out, restart the server. Pretty much everything else is happening in Chef. If it isn't directly related to getting a new version of the code running in a browser, then I'm typically not doing it in Capistrano. I'm typically doing it in Chef. Most of the time, because those kind of changes you'll want to persist. I mean, you need to run it once, and that's kind of it. But so yeah, it depends on what you need to do in your Capistrano scripts. Like if it's some kind of conditional logic that's related to your deploy, it could make sense to keep it in a command that you would run in Capistrano. So the eventual goal for me is to get rid of Capistrano entirely. Ezra at Engineer wrote a Chef recipe or gem kind of extension thing called Chef Deploy, which you essentially give it your Git repository, and it does cool deploy stuff. You know, when some branch is changed, it'll pull down the code and restart the server and all that kind of cool stuff. So there's definitely people that are doing a lot of things in that direction that could completely get rid of Capistrano from that stack. So.
Have you had a chance to look at Moonshine in comparison?
Briefly, when I saw it mentioned on the mailing list, I don't really know anything about it, Moonshine, haven't used it. It seemed to me to be kind of in that gap of running a fancy script to do stuff for you automatically, kind of like Deprec, perhaps. Maybe someone else knows better about Moonshine?
Well, as far as I know, Moonshine doesn't. I could be wrong about this, but I haven't used it with EC2, so I don't know if it works with that. Works great on Slice Host, but I mean that's about it. I don't know what you wanted me to say.
But would you compare it to Deprec, perhaps?
I haven't even really used Deprec, so I mean it's based on Puppet, and then it just kind of I think it handles the it gives you the nice, easy to use config files and just like does like hashes on those to make sure to see if anything's changed or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. We'll have to check it out. So you'll have to do a talk on that next month.
Yeah, I'm totally down with that.
Any other questions, Chef, EC2? We got one over here.
Quick question. Would you still use Chef even if you weren't managing a bunch of servers? I mean, if you just have, like 1 to 3, is it worth
Good question.
digging into?
At this point, I probably would, just because I've kind of got the experience at it now. It's pretty easy to whip up a recipe and get it running. The key in there is getting to that workflow of pushing out your changes to the server and getting it to run. So once I get this bit of code that I wrote for work polished up into kind of a gem or something, I could see that being a very viable option. But I will confess that I did use Deprec on an app that I deployed a couple months ago. I just needed one instance needed the whole stack installed on it, run a deprec command, and ready to go. So if you have just one server and you don't anticipate yourself making a ton of changes to it, you don't need kind of day-by-day fine-grained control over it, I would say Chef probably is not worth the time investment. It definitely takes a good couple of weeks to get fluent at it if you're kind of stumbling along by yourself. And I'm happy to answer questions for anyone that is interested in that and kind of speeding up that learning curve. So yeah.
Okay, one more for you. Do you focus more on the bootstrapping installation or more on the monitoring day-to-day stuff with Chef? Just, I mean, with a shell script, you know, you see what you see is what you get. Syntax errors aren't going to happen as easily. I feel like it's just copy and paste, you know, whatever. Got a nice little gist going, you know, paste it in and done. I feel like with a Chef recipe for installation, even with what you showed up there, you know, just adding Ruby Enterprise onto the Bootstrap thing that you had to paste into EC2 anyway. You know, you could easily throw Passenger and other gems and stuff in there.
The place where it really shines is when you want to upgrade the version of something. So say a new version of Passenger or Ruby Enterprise gets released and you want to use it on your servers, you change one attribute in one file, run it again, and a couple minutes later it's updated on all of your servers. It's especially handy if you're running more than one app server. I mean, it's kind of hard to I mean, you can usually get these kinds of changes done faster than you can SSH and like do one of them manually. You can have all of your app servers upgraded. So it's definitely the kind of time investment you make with a more long-term goal in mind. And the great thing about that too is as you maintain, as you upgrade, you have a set of recipes that's up to date with the latest and greatest. And if you ever need to spin up an entirely new cluster or 2 or 3 brand new servers, for even just for some kind of throwaway testing environment, you can run one command to do that and be good to go. So I sound more like a salesman right now than a programmer. I'm not getting any kickbacks from ops code.
I'm curious, why do you need the Bootstrap? I mean, couldn't you just install Chef and the requirements on a EC2 instance and just boot off that instead of the default?
Sure. It comes down to the AMIs that you're starting with.
Right. With
EC2, you could easily package an AMI that has Chef installed, and typically in this kind of, like if you're managing a cluster of servers on EC2, that's what you're going to do is you're going to build all the stuff you need on it. You're going to make a fresh AMI out of that, and then any new instance you spin up is going to come out of that AMI. And the term for that is the golden embryo, the one that can kind of turn into any role that you need to. So, and I've done that at work too. I have just a default role that has all the common things like users and stuff that takes a long time to compile, like ImageMagick or our video or whatever. And then that way when I need to spin up a new worker instance or a new app instance, and I'm not building all that stuff from scratch. So, and you can conceivably do the same thing with Chef. And as far as the bootstrapping goes too, recently Opscode has packaged as bundled Chef into an apt-get package. So you can just get it in Karmic, you just apt-get install Chef, apt-get install whatever, and you're up and running, which saves you from installing Ruby, Ruby gems, that kind of stuff. So. Questions? You guys have great questions. I should have skipped all the slides and gone straight to questions. And that sounds like it. So again, if you have any questions about this stuff, feel free to email me. Like I'm on the list, or just start a thread on the list, and we'll definitely get that happening. I will let you guys know when I have my little provisioning, bootstrapping shell script, Ruby script up and running, and in a Git repo somewhere. And that's that. So thanks, guys.